the power of it is that if you walk away, you establish that you are serious about your demand and that you're serious about the consequences. If you get to 24 hours and then you extend that deadline again, then you lose face. And that means that you can't use that tool to your advantage anymore. And I've seen this used really, really badly. As a matter of fact, if I go back to my divorce example, my solicitors would set deadline for my ex's solicitors, and they were like, "Oh, you need to give us an answer within the 1 week. If by Friday, I don't know, the 18th of March, you haven't got those documents in line, then we're gonna follow through with those consequences." And what was hilarious, retrospectively, is that my solicitors would set those deadlines, and then they would come to me the day before the deadline and say, "Oh, do you want to go through with the consequences, or perhaps do you want to choose this particular option?"
Hello and welcome to a new episode of the Needle Movers podcast, a podcast that brings you the lessons, books and concepts we wish we had known earlier on in our lives. When I say we, it is myself, of course, your host Mark Jasons, and my co-host Valerio Tomasa.
Hello, wherever you're listening from, and welcome.
If you're listening today, our episode is from our book club series, where we bring to you a book that we have been reading together and take away some key concepts, break them out into these episodes so you can digest and get some hopefully useful actions that you can utilize in your life.
And today we are going to be looking at Never Split the Difference. This is part 2 of this particular book, written by Chris Voss. And today in particular, we're going to be looking at Never Compromise. This is a topic that in my mind didn't really make sense at the beginning, but hopefully by the end of the day will also make sense to you. So whilst doing my MBA at Quantech, and throughout my professional career for that matter, I always heard that negotiating was about finding a middle ground and compromising. So this typically means that you start at a really high point if you're selling, and if you're buying, you start at a really low point, and you try to get somewhere in between, where if you're selling, you try to make the most out of the person buying, and if you're buying, you try to take away as much as possible for the person that is selling. Fairly simple concepts. That's how I went about compromising. So that means that when I was negotiating vendors for my wedding a few months back, what I tended to do was to ask the price from a few vendors. I used to get to a point where I would take maybe 3 quotes, maybe take 4 quotes. I would maybe take the one which was better value for money, and I would call that my base quote. And then I will probably remove 20-30% from it and say, okay, when I go negotiating, I'm going to say that I want X amount. So for example, if I were to think about my florist, I would take the 3 quotes that I have, which was maybe 7,000, 8,000, and 6,000 pounds. I would say, okay, what I really want to do is only maybe spend 80% of my lowest quote. And I would then go back to every single vendor and say, okay, this is my absolute minimum budget. My absolute maximum budget. I don't want to spend any more money than this. And then I would essentially enter this negotiation phase with those 3 vendors and kind of hope for the best. That's really what you need to do. Hope for the best.
It's funny if you actually went to them with your minimum value. I was like, that you just shooting yourself in both feet. Like, take all my money, please. It's that difference.
But this is kind of like what I thought negotiation was all about, and this is what I thought that the best technique of getting the price that I wanted was. And as a matter of fact, I did manage to reduce the price by a fair bit with a few vendors. So £500 here, £1,000 there, and overall, as I managed to save quite a bit of money. You know, weddings are expensive, and you try to save as much as possible. But I think this book provides a fresh perspective as to how you should do your negotiating, what you should do to get to a space where you're not compromising what you feel that is most important to you.
So what that reminds me of is the like when I was doing my MBA as well, they discuss BATNA. So what that is for people who aren't aware is the best
Do you think they
alternative.
discuss Batman?
I said BATNA, but you heard Batman, which tells me what your mind is, and also makes me concerned about if you're a vigilante when you go out at night, what you actually get up to. But no, there's basically three things. One of them is BATNA, which is the best alternative to the negotiated agreement. Um, and that helps you set a desired outcome and assess the strength of your offer of others' offers. But remember, we're talking about never compromising. So why do you even need to know that? Then, if it's a sale or something, you're looking at like the reservation price. So the worst deal the negotiator will accept. That's useful for you because if you're not going to compromise, of course, you need to see what they'll no longer accept before they are like no longer interested. Sorry, and then finally there's a ZOPA, which is the zone of possible agreement. This is the range in which a deal that satisfies both parties, yourself and the negotiatee, can occur. And so the bounds are set by each person's reservation price in this case when it comes to MBA. But the reason I bring this up is because when it's never compromise, all those things are just utilized to understand your position. So it's like pre-prep planning that you can utilize, and then you go in with the mindset and the what we're going to explain here of not then compromising your position or not then compromising on what you're aiming to get. So if it's a raise to a certain amount, you use those as artillery or weaponry or things in hand that will help you. Which I know in the book they don't really talk about that at all. It's very specific to like sales negotiations in business, but it's something that just for our larger audience is kind of good to know and to think about and understand, and then not compromise. Like you take it and say, "Oh, I see," but also I'm not going to make sure that I get the best value that I come for, and I've managed to avoid compromising.
And I think the other point, which is really worthwhile talking from an MBA perspective, is the kind of people that you could end up in a, let's call it, bargaining or negotiations situation with. And you may have people that could be quite reasonable, but then you can also end up with people classified as untrusty opponents. And those are the kind of people that have got a bad reputation. They could provide misleading information. They could make suspicious requests. But also you've got the die-hard bargainers. So those are the kind of people that will, for example, go to a supermarket and try to ask for 2% off or 50p off. And I remember, like, I didn't think that this was a thing, but I remember at one point going shopping with one of my neighbors, and my neighbor was trying to negotiate with a stall that we were buying from, and the prices were fixed, right? Like they had like little little cards, and there was a fixed price. There was no bargaining signs anywhere, and my neighbor wasn't happy to buy from them. So we're talking about like a £20 item, and they ended up going away with a 10p discount just for the sake of a discount. But they were only happy to step away with the item, although they needed it once they received the 10p discount. Why?
It,
Like, why spend 20 minutes bargaining for 10p?
to make yourself
Anyway,
feel
putting that on the
satisfied.
side.
No, I want to go into that because it
It's
reminds me of like Tim Ferriss and Gary Vaynerchuk. The like Tim Ferriss advocates going and doing the exercise of like getting asking for a free say Starbucks coffee or whatever, and it's for the sake of like building confidence and stuff. But Gary Vaynerchuk loves to go to like what are they, car boot sales or front yard sales and stuff, and will always try and get a higher a deal on something that's already a deal. We can get into his books about crushing it. They're very good at crush it, but it's just interesting because yeah, why must you haggle on a fixed price? Because then you do realize that it is coming out of someone's pocket to pay that back. If you've worked in retail or stuff, you're already aware those tills need to add up. so once someone has pushed hard and said yes, that fixed price of £20, I got it for 15. I'll never forget when I was shopping once in a store called Boots in the UK, and I'd found £20. No, the cashier had given me I'd given them £20, and they gave me my change, which was like £15, and the £20, £35, and I was so gleeful. I was young, I was ready to take it home, and then I realized that's going out of someone's pocket. Like my win is a huge loss on their part. So I gave it back because I was like, hey, by the way, you've overpaid me, and that's about to hit you and your till more than me. But yeah, in terms of people who do like strive for discounts or uh, I guess it's that refusal to compromise in situations that don't require it is what I look at it like. There are those archetypes, and this isn't about that. That's not even a negotiation. That's just a well, it can be seen as a negotiation, but it's like a, I don't know, a people problem. Is how I think of it.
It is a people problem, and the very last one I think worth mentioning is one group of people classified as spoilers. So those are the kind of people that don't want to reach a deal because they feel that it would create a negative change. So they feel like they're getting the a worse situation or worse result out of it. And I remember from what's advised in the MBA is when you have those kind of people, that's when you want to try and explain the benefit and the value that you are creating with the deal going forward. But bearing this in mind and bearing the kind of people that you can get through, now we can probably go back to the point of the book, which was to never compromise.
And let's talk about how to avoid compromise in the first place. So let's take time and how you can use it to your advantage. When used well, it can be used as a powerful tool for tranquility or anxiety or to create pressure. You may or may not know about how, if you are in a conversation with someone, or if you're negotiating, or if you're just uh, even having a disagreement with someone, giving them just time can get people so aroused or anxious due to it, and make them start just speaking. So it was a tactic I employed in meetings where if you just count in your head mentally 7 seconds, people don't like to leave a void of silence, and it can get them to just keep talking to try and
Mm.
get it so there's no blank space. Like, especially when there's potentially tension in the room, and if you're negotiating, there could be some form of tension or something. It's a very useful tool to have in your arsenal of time. So you just, yeah, like I said, you can apply pressure, you can create anxiety, or allow for tranquility. You can allow for things to dissipate depending on how you use time and if it's used well. And especially if you then determine or decide, I say, to provide deadlines. If you've seen stores or like they're like kicking off negotiations with this, with their closing down sales, though they never close down, or limited time only, like a number of limited offers and things. If you establish deadlines, you get the other party to make decisions because they are afraid to lose something. Suddenly, something that could have been open is now got a closed um time frame, and therefore it adds that urgency, it adds that limited scope, and it makes it much more that, well, it of course, like I said, provides that pressure in it. And so it's useful when providing deadlines. However, deadlines can also be flexible, meaning you can use this to your advantage. So if they provide a deadline, you can also negotiate that deadline, right? And that helps you to uh, bypass the compromise, or enforce the fact that you won't compromise. So if someone's provided a compromise and you don't want to take it, you then establish the time limit, saying this deal's on offer for X amount of time period. Otherwise, I'm gone. Or if they've provided compromise and you're like, actually, how much time does it need for this? Like, does it need to be today? Can it be tomorrow? And there you can make sure it's more flexible. So basically, understanding that time is a tool and using it in whichever form or fashion you think can provide the most leverage or benefit to your negotiations is a key factor that the book points out or highlights.
I was thinking back to the example that we talked about in the previous episode. The first topic of this particular book, which was when you travel to Nigeria and the fact that you were at the market and there was people out there practically getting ripped off, and there
Yeah.
was you that are trying to get the best price possible, get just asking for 20% of that particular price. And I guess something that comes to mind is time as a negotiation tool when you are in a market, for instance. And I think there is a lot of material out there that talks about the best time to go to a market. And one of the things that I read in the past is that if you go to a market towards the end of the day, that's when you're likely to get the best deals. Now there is downsides to that, of course, because you might be able to get better deals, but on the other side, you probably have less things available, so you've got less selection available to you. But because the day is ending, and because the seller is trying to make a last minute deal and a last minute buck, let's call it, then you're in a much better position of walking away with an item for a much lower price than you originally anticipated. And it makes me wonder, like in the case of going to negotiate to a market in Nigeria, as you were a few weeks back, it makes me wonder what
Months.
impact time would have had. And perhaps if those Italian tourists that you refer to, and if they had gone to the market towards the end of the day, whether they would have been able to get a better deal or be in a position where they would have been able to negotiate better.
I'd say that regardless of that, they'd have still ended up getting ripped off because they pulled out the wrong currency. When you're pulling out euros instead of naira, they've already won. They destroyed them the moment, and
So there was
kudos to
no hope
them.
for them.
Yeah, there was no hope, but it was kudos to that to the marketers because they were just like okay. And I think of it this way: when I look back on that, I think both parties felt like they won. Like the Italians were thinking they've got a steal; it's so cheap, which it is relative. But then the marketers were thinking they've just destroyed it because, and it's funny, it's what happens on a large scale when you think of our phones and all of that. They get the materials for so cheap, pennies, and then sell them for hundreds of pounds. And it's just that happening in a live environment. So both felt like they won. So in that negotiation, both parties went away feeling like a win. And I was the only one as an outside observer saying, no, you really lost. That one was not your not your benefit. But hey, it is how it is.
So the additional perspective that I'm gonna add here for the listeners is that time is almost multidimensional. So we just spoke about how if you get to the market last minute, you can probably walk away with a really good bargain because someone is trying
Mm-hmm.
to make a quick buck at the end of it. However, if you get to the market early enough, you have a chance to speak to all the sellers. So that means that you could find two, three, four sellers, perhaps selling exactly the same thing. And when you do that, you allow yourself time to negotiate and to anchor the price to a lower asking price. So that means that potentially you could walk away with a bigger bargain. And that's exactly what happens as well in the professional world, right? So if you've got a project and you've got enough time to speak to four, five, six different vendors, that's when you can potentially walk away with a really good price because you've had a chance to contrast and compare multiple different vendors, multiple different offers, and as a consequence of that, you've got a much larger period of time to negotiate. So you've
I
got
think
different ways of looking at time.
yeah. I think that's funny because the way you've described it there, in which the book doesn't really encapsulate, is again, it's like the pre work to negotiation. From what I've captured, and please keep me honest here, the book really does focus on the once you're in the stage, once you're with a party, this is how you should address it. And so this is if you're one on one with them, you can then utilize the fact that you have time to talk with others to your benefit, right? Like this is a deadline. I'm going to be talking to the next person. I've got to this market early. I know what my position of power is. And whereas if you've decided on the vendor, or in this case, because that's in a I guess like a vendor position, but you might just be in some form of negotiating with family, with friends, with whomever. Maybe you're just like, let's go to this certain go karting place, but I want it to be at this location, but I want it to be at that location nearest me. And it's just about what you can do in those moments, and that's where it's like, I'm not going to compromise. I will, and it's funny because we're in a friendship circle, so you can see where someone can say something like, I'm not going to travel beyond 1 hour outside of where I live, and that will then dictate where we will make the venue, right? Like once you've established something, after the fact that you've set up, okay, say we said there's multiple different vendors for this go-karting, but then we've selected the one. And now we're at the point where we just need to say which, that since it's this vendor, where are their locations? And then someone then establishes that they're not going to compromise. They will not travel beyond 1 hour from where they live. It limits that choice down. And if they
I know
refuse to
exactly
comply,
who you're talking about.
it's as if I'm using a real life scenario. But it's but you understand what I'm saying, right? The book does take it to that second. It's like in my mind there's multiple degrees to negotiation. There's the pre-work for it, there's the build up to it, and there's the interface when you're in person with them. And of course there's the aftercare. Actually, I should say there's always the after, because you never know if you're going to have to go back and negotiate again.
And the thing about time is that time is supposed to be used intelligently, right? So if you say that I need to make the decision within 24 hours, and if I don't get the decision, I'm going to walk away from this
Hmm.
deal. The power of it is that if you walk away, you establish that you are serious about your demand and that you're serious about the consequences. If you get to 24 hours
Mm.
and then you extend that deadline again, then you lose face. And that means that you can't use that tool to your advantage anymore. And I've seen this used really, really badly. As a matter of fact, if I go back to my divorce example, my solicitors would set deadline for my ex's solicitors, and they were like, "Oh, you need to give us an answer within the 1 week. If by Friday, I don't know, the 18th of March, you haven't got those documents in line, then we're going to follow through with those consequences." And what was hilarious retrospectively is that my solicitors would set those deadlines, and then they would come to me the day before the deadline and say, "Oh, do you want to go through with the consequences, or perhaps do you want to choose this particular option?" And of course, it makes a lot of sense for them to propose that to me, because if I choose the option B, which is less drastic and looks more, let's say, appealing to a human being, then that means that probably it's going to extend the case and they're going to make more money. Um, but from the perspective of ensuring that there is consequences and that actions and deadlines are being taken seriously for the purpose of never compromising and for the purpose of negotiating, then you're supposed to be following through with the consequences. Because if I had done that at the beginning, that would have set the precedent. And because the precedent was in place, then the subsequent deadlines would have been taken seriously.
It's I think about when it comes to like picnic. I think I discussed it before about how you're supposed to give feedback, positive, immediate, and consistent, and then negative, immediate, and consistent. And it's not about feedback; it's about negotiating and the time frame of it. And here, the consistency. What you're saying is the danger, because yeah, it extends the time, but then how? Who knows? It seems like he always gives us a break at the last hour, and then suddenly they'll always wait till then, and be like, all right, dates come. So what are you going to give us now? Like it's not. How do you trust that word, right? How do you believe what they're saying? But it is. I guess it is. I think you said it perfectly. It needs to be used. I think you said educated or smartly, or just yeah, used with a
With
brain
purpose.
cell or two. Yeah, with purpose. And you can't just take time for granted, because it will slip past you and then you're in trouble. I think about the non-negotiation things that we use time for. For instance, when I was buying my tickets to Nigeria, they can get very expensive. I was going in the December period, and so it would rise, and so I had to determine what was the best time frame to purchase them and when the prices would be lower, not just in the day but in the year. And previous year, with COVID happening, I waited way too long, and it ended up costing me, let's say, 4 times the amount it should. So, but that's in when I'm not actually negotiating with a person. That's just me checking what an airline's going to do. But when you're talking with someone else, um, that really can drive, and especially when you're aware of what their circumstances are and your own, it can really drive a lot to help you in avoiding compromise and getting exactly what you want.
Feels like we talked an awful lot about time, but it makes a lot of sense in a way. It's a very powerful tool, and I think we had an extensive experience of it being used really well, but also it being used really, really poorly, like in the example of my divorce. But having
Hmm.
said that, the second tool that we can employ in our arsenal is fairness. And we all think that we are logical decision makers. And I think we've covered it in enough podcasts to highlight the fact that we aren't. We are, in fact, um, creatures that don't use logic at all in any way. And science has shown that at the point where we're making decisions, emotions take over. So in the
Mm.
past, I've used examples such as I want to buy a new car, and instead of buying the car that makes a lot of sense from economic perspective, the one that would save me £100 a month, I ended up buying the car which I was familiar with, which I had perhaps good memories with. And that doesn't
Mm.
make a lot of sense because if I was rational and if I was working off the spreadsheet, I would have ended up buying the one that was cheaper and had exactly the same features, but I haven't. So if we think back to the example that we talked about in our previous episode on this particular topic, which is going to the boss for a pay rise, if your boss comes back to you and makes you a counter offer which you're not happy with, then that's when you can employ the fairness factor. So if I go to my boss and ask them for a 10% pay rise, and after a period of time they come back to me with a 5% pay rise, that's when we can use a small sentence such as, I just want what's fair, to induce a little bit of a guilt trip, but also an accusation that induces a little bit of discomfort. And if you think about it, you're not saying, "Oh, that's outrageous. I'm not happy with that." You're not using anything which comes across as, let's say, harsh, but you're using something which brings up the fairness factor, and you say, I just want what's fair. And ultimately, you already made your case that you have been working really hard, you have completed X number of projects, you have gone above and beyond your scope, and you're now connecting it with the fairness factor. So you want what's fair. And it's something that induces that, as I said, the guilt that will cause your manager to reflect upon your offer and maybe come back with something that is different.
I just want what's fair. It's such a funny. It's a funny. It's like passive aggression, right? Where it's like it's not even aggression. It's just passive. It's passive enough to make them wonder or second guess themselves. Am I being fair? They just want what's fair. Is this fair? Suddenly the exercise or the onus is on them to determine. Am I being unfair? Is there a way? And it's yeah, it's like an accusation that's not an accusation. You've not said you're being unfair, which is what people tend to do. This is not fair, and they're like, wait, I am. You get defensive, but it's just I just want what's fair. And if it is fair, it's on you to figure out. And yeah, that's where that discomfort is easily introduced, and suddenly you leave it with them to play with. Like I said before, it does sound manipulative. However, it's just influential if you're
And
using it right.
that's what the goal is to some extent, right? Because you don't want to come across as the bitter or as the problematic person when you're
Mm,
negotiating, but at the same time, you what you want to do is ask the questions or make the statement that will cause the other person to think and reflect on the situation and come closer to what you want. And
mm.
this is the perfect tool for it because it allows you to bring up the fairness together with your demand or together with your asking price or whatever it may be, and use that as a packaged sentence to try and push you closer to what you're trying to achieve.
Very true. And it's I guess some people might think, oh, the world is already unfair, and but then they have to vocalize it, and in a at least in a office manner. That's not sign of oh negotiation. It just shows how unwilling to even negotiate they are if they're like the world isn't fair or anything like that. So be aware that like not everyone's responsive might be the same, but there is this I guess this universal, I'd say, sense of fairness and unfairness that people tried to quell. So it's funny, you introduce internal conflict and therefore get your resolution of not having to compromise. In a sense, I want raise, let me do certain things, let me explain things that will make them have to second guess their own selves, that gives you said raise. And it's yeah, it's funny. Do you think you've utilized that sentence before? I just want
I
what's fair.
haven't. I haven't, but
Neither
I
have I.
will.
Yeah. I haven't, but I will. Same. I probably won't bring it back to the episode, or maybe I will. I'll tell you how. I'll tell the audience exactly how it goes when I do utilize it and see how it did seem to impact. And it's funny because when you do things like this, like I'll call it an experiment, um, it's not that you're fully aware that that was the thing that changed it, right? Because the only test you'll have is having used it in that scenario. So you don't have the alternative where you didn't. But it should be interesting to see anyway. I want to see when I introduce the, I just want what's fair. And maybe it's the response, you'll see the internal turmoil go on in front of your face or hear when they come back to you later on. But yeah, I think it's a nice, interesting trick to avoid compromise. So we're here, we talk about what leveraging the time, but then also making them aware, like using the fact of fairness to get what you want in the end.
Absolutely. And I think this takes us to the end of this particular episode, looking at never compromising, which really has got two tools in the arsenal. The first one is time, and how you can use the multidimensional time to your advantage, whether that is by setting a deadline or perhaps by looking to utilize time to your advantage to be able to scope your negotiation and be able to get the best offer or the offer that you exactly want by using time to your advantage. And the second element was fairness, which looks at how you can use fairness in the offer making moment to your advantage, which can also give you that final deciding factor and realize that perhaps the offer that you're not getting is not good enough, and that's maybe the trigger, or that's perhaps the message that you need in order to know that you need to step away, move away, and perhaps in the context of a job find yourself a different job.
And these, I know we threw in our own thoughts, theories, and experiences, and some from what we've learned in MBA, but this is all from, of course, Never Split the Difference, a book by Chris Voss. So please, like we always say, give it a read if you are so inclined. Otherwise, just keep listening to us. This is part 2. There will be more in the future. But as always, I have been your host, Mark Jasons, and my co-host, of course.
Super Mario, I'm joking, Valerio Tomaso.
You know where to find us. We are on YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, wherever there's social media at the.needle.movers. We have our own website. It is theneedlemovers.xyz. And wherever you listen to podcasts, give us a good old 5-star rating and leave us a review or give us some feedback. And any suggestions on books or concepts or theories you'd like us to discuss, let us know. If you'd like to collaborate as well, feel free to throw it in there. Just put anything in our feedback as well as a 5-star review, and we'll take it.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. We hope you've enjoyed this episode. And as always, till next time.
Adios.